All right, so we're powering through, and we're going to do the last section of our session. And I guess this is a good leeway to take a step back. We've been talking about some of the technical or details of earthquake early warning, but let's talk about warnings in general for now. So we have Sally, but Sally can't join us today, but she shared a video on why do people respond different ways to warnings about impending hazards. And after that, we'll have Sara Harrison, who'll talk a little bit more about warnings, but not specifically on earthquake space. And this might be of interest to you, Gavin, because it might be more related to weather. So, so it would be quite interesting to take a step back and look at warnings and how that plays out in this discussion on earthquake early warning. So I'm going to try to see if I can share a video. If bear with me for a minute. And so we have a video from Sally, and can everybody see that? Oops, sorry, no, not yet. Share. And then make sure I share.
Virtually joining us virtually.
She's joining us virtually in our virtual meeting. All right, so I'll just play that, and it's a really good talk actually.
Hi everyone, as Graham said, I conduct social science research on the communication of warnings across a variety of natural hazards. So something that a lot of people who warn the public say to me is, I wrote a perfectly clear warning, why did people not respond? And the answer is there are many, many different reasons why people don't respond to a warning or respond in different ways. And that's been summarised by the global literature, and there are a number of theoretical models that we can draw on to explain these sort of things. For example, the Lindell and Perry model, it's called the Protective Action Decision model. So we know that receiver characteristics influence their response to a warning, such as their age, gender, primary language, their economic and social resources. So for example, we know that women are more likely to respond to a warning. Environmental cues also influence their response, such as feeling the ground shaking, seeing storm clouds gathering, or seeing the waterline recede before a tsunami. Social cues also influence their response. So for example, seeing your neighbours evacuate or your friends and family prepare for a future disaster. The warning messages themselves can also create that influence, so particularly the content and format, which I'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide. People's channel access and preference is also an influence. So whether or not they're big users of social media and they have a smartphone in their pocket, or if they're more reliant on the newspapers, TV and radio. And then the frequency and detail that those information sources deliver the information is also an influence. That information that arrives then goes through a filter from that receiver in terms of how much exposure they've had to that warning message, the attention that they pay to it, and how well they understand what it said. And then they can apply their own risk perceptions to that warning. So the level of threat that they think that hazard is posing to them, which is further influenced by things like experience and their location. Then their perceptions on the protective action come into play. So things like how effective they think the guidance message is to actually saving them and those sort of things. And then the stakeholder perceptions as well. So you can see there are a lot of different things that go on in their minds, and everybody's different and every situation's different. So based on all of that information, that person decides whether or not to respond and how to respond. And that response might be to seek further information, which means repeating the whole process again. So it can take place over a very, very short amount of time if the threat perception is particularly high and the message is very clear, but it can also take place over quite a long period of time. As an example of some recent research I've been involved in, I conducted a global literature review to advise the Ministry of Civil Defence Emergency Management here on how best to construct a short warning message. So this was particularly for the emergency mobile alerts on cell broadcast here in New Zealand. And it's for messages up to about 900 characters, but it can also be applied to social media and other short warnings. I had a steering group from civil defence sector to help me guide this research to make sure it was appropriate for that format. And so based on that and testing it using a hypothetical tsunami scenario in the Wellington region, and so that involved 28 people doing clipboard surveys around the Wellington region to see how they would intend to respond to a short message for tsunami warnings. I found that the message needs to be useful, so the content needs to include the source of the information, information about the hazard and impacts, specific guidance information and location information about who's going to be affected, the time that they need to respond to the warning by, and the time that the warning was issued. And it's in that particular order for messages between 500 and 1400 characters. It should include a link to further information to cut down the milling time, it's called, before people then act. And if it's an update, it should say that it's an update. The message should be specific, so as previous speakers have mentioned, make it as personalised as possible and include city names or even less, more discreet if you can, so that they really know that it's going to affect them. The message should be clear and simple with no acronyms, particularly for agencies like to put their acronyms in, but unless you have clear evidence showing that everybody knows what that means, try and avoid it. The action that you're putting in your message needs to be effective. So people need to think that they can achieve that action. It should be affordable and effective in reducing the risk. And of course, it should be triple checked for accuracy so that trust isn't jeopardised. And I've got my report at the bottom there that you can get for free on the GNS website if you want any further information on that. Thank you.
Cool. I think that was a really an interesting presentation. Yeah, so as Sally said, she'll be happy to answer other questions. So if you have questions, you can send them to me and I can pass it on to her or connect you with Sally if there are any questions about her presentation. But unfortunately, she can't join us today. But next we have Sara Harrison from Massey University, and she's going to talk about impact-based warnings and what we can learn from afield. So Sara, if you're online and you can share a screen.
Yep, good morning. I'm just going to figure out how to share my screen. Where did it go? I can't find my slides. There we go. Okay, all right. Hi, everyone. I'm Sara Harrison. I'm a PhD candidate at the Joint Center for Disaster Research, and Sally's actually one of my supervisors, as well as Raj. So Marian gave a really good introduction for me. So my background is for severe weather hazards and warnings. So I'm going to introduce the concept of impact-based warnings within the severe weather context, and then kind of ask questions of what this means for earthquake early warnings if impact-based warnings are a goal for that hazard. So what are impact-based forecasts and warnings? They differ from traditional warnings by communicating what the hazards will do rather than only what they will be. Identifying the specific social, economic, and environmental impacts of a hazard has been argued to allow communities to adjust their plans and actions to better cope with the consequences of the hazard. So in this example here, we see how extensive traffic delays have been due to large trees downing and power lines downing, blocking roads. That's been identified as a potential impact, and this will allow people to plan for delays on their commute, for example. So this provides additional meaning to the warning recipient for them to plan ahead and make more informed decisions. Despite the push for impact-based forecasts and warnings by the World Meteorological Organization, evaluations of the effectiveness of these warnings with regards to public response and perceptions of the warnings have shown mixed results. There are some anticipated and experienced benefits, such as adding meaning and context, minimizing warning fatigue, enhancing risk perceptions, and increasing intentions to act. But there are also some potential risks that have been identified. So they seem to work better for some weather hazards than for others, and impact-based warnings can incite either appropriate or inappropriate behaviors or intended behaviors depending on message content and hazard severity. So I'll give you an example for tornadoes. Some researchers found that impact-based warnings led to greater behavioral intentions of sheltering in place, while others found that impact-based messages have the potential to backfire, as the results did show an increased probability of taking shelter for events tagged with light to severe impact. But with tags of higher impacts like devastating or incredible, the probability of sheltering decreased while the probability of evacuating increased. This kind of behavior could result in people putting themselves at even more risk to ending up in the tornado's path. So if audiences misunderstand the warning and consequently fail to act appropriately to protect themselves, the perceived credibility and trustworthiness of the warning and the warning services can be negatively affected. As such, while impact-based warnings do have the potential to improve warning response, they need to be designed appropriately according to the hazard and the audience. So what does this mean for earthquake early warnings? Is there a future for impact-based warnings in this space? I want to offer some food for thought on this. So like I mentioned, credibility or perceptions of credibility and trust in warnings and warning services have been found to be significant factors when audiences assess warning messages and decide how to respond. In the USA, researchers found that scary messages were perceived as less credible than traditional warnings, and that participants felt that the information conveyed in impact messages was overblown and thus rated the source as less reliable. Fear-inducing language has been found to be less effective in inciting appropriate protective actions than strong impact language. So when it comes to earthquakes, I think that there is a risk of communicating scary messages for strong and severe earthquakes. So we have to be careful not to scare the warning recipients and causing them to distrust the warning system itself. If impact-based warnings are a goal for earthquake early warnings, we need to do more research to identify the benefits and risks and determine if they're actually appropriate for this hazard. If there is a place for impact-based warnings and earthquake early warnings, what would they look like? How can we predict the impacts of an earthquake? This is still a question for severe weather as well. How can we predict the impacts of a severe weather hazard? Well, I'm sure you're all wondering why I use the word predict. We can't predict the impacts, but we can make educated guesses or forecasts based on the data that we have. Fortunately, the GeoNet Felt reports provide a rich data set of documented experiences and impacts. And the USGS Pager tool is an example of a rapid impact assessment that provides estimated impacts within 30 minutes of an earthquake anywhere in the world. This isn't a warning, of course, but it provides an opportunity to tap into rich data sources of earthquake strengths and impacts where we could rapidly link earthquake strength to potential impacts once an earthquake is felt and include this impact information in the warning. This is assuming that there is technological capacity to do so, and I have no idea if there is. So that's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Sara. That was a great presentation, and I think you posed like really interesting questions and a lot of insight from the weather space. So thank you for that.
Oh, Julie's going to hand
Yeah,
up.
Julia.
I mean, I think the two presentations really just kind of highlight some of the differences maybe and the considerations for earthquake early warning. So if you look at Sally's presentation where she talks about like the process that people go through, I mean, you're basically condensing all of that into what might be a few seconds or maybe up to a minute. And so the key question is, how do you help people to move through that process really quickly so that they can take the correct action? And then the other thing that Sara was talking about that we sort of looked at a little bit was like, yeah, what are some of the kinds of information that people are interested in terms of warnings? So they obviously want to hear about the shaking that's going to happen and that it's going to be strong shaking. They want to know about what actions to take, but they're also quite interested in some of this impact information. But where you put that in the sequence is the big question. So do you put that in the initial message where you at risk of kind of making the message too big and too long and too hard to like look at and respond to? Or are you kind of trying to integrate that into some of the information that comes out in the warnings later on? So all really good questions, I think, about how you kind of put those warnings and the information kind of together as a package. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Julia. Any other comments, questions? Go ahead, Gavin.
I think to just build upon what Julia was saying, some of the things we've been thinking about with EMAs here in Canterbury is how we can potentially construct a post AF8 or any major earthquake emergency mobile alert message that really does outline some of those next actions we want people to take after the earthquake, assuming of course that the cell towers are still operational at that point, and we can get we can use the emergency mobile alert portal to actually connect to the mobile networks and send the signal. There are it's where other apps, like perhaps the Red Cross Hazard app, comes into play. They have got a lot of pre-prepared messages that are already stored on the device, so they're not dependent upon having any communications available. So after the event, even if the cellular coverage has gone, people can look at the Hazard app and go, just had an earthquake, what should we be doing? So there's certainly work taking place through both the Red Cross Hazards app working group and the Common Alerting Protocol working group to look at what some of these standard messages should be for events like severe weather, like flooding, like tsunami, like earthquakes, so that we can actually have these clear messaging defined ahead of time and already stored on someone's phone, rather than having to push it to them after an event where we may not be able to, depending on the state of the mobile communications network. But as someone who has the ability to send emergency mobile alerts, I always encourage, when I'm working with our duty officer team, to think about a campaign of messages. There's never just one message. You're always going to have at least 2. You're going to have a starting message and an ending message. And you often have to think of it a lot more in a campaign of messages. What's the first one going to be, but then how are you going to follow it up, and how are you going to close it off at the end and actually say, this is the end of this event for now. Everything else you need to go off and just get information from websites or traditional information sources. But it's a way of thinking, and in bringing it back to earthquake early warning, the first message or the first couple of messages may be automated, but we're going to have to pick, as duty officers, we're then going to have to pick that up and think about, well, what are we going to send as that potential 3rd message or 4th message, and when are we actually going to close it off and not send any more messages? So any earthquake early warnings are part of a much larger campaign of public alerting that's going to take place, particularly for something like an alpine fault event.
Thanks for that. Any other questions, comments from people?
You've done so well to push through. It's like a long session with no breaks. So
yeah, but I think we've got a really good.
Julia, yes.
Yeah.
I just had another comment to make, only because I really like, this is my area, so I kind of like this kind of stuff. Just an interesting comment was like one of the headings in Sally's diagram was around environmental cues. So often, as she said, people use environmental cues as part of their warning, kind of as their warning or as processing their kind of information about the warning. And so, in a meteorological sense, like I remember when we looked at the Edgecombe flooding, people said that they went out and stood on the bridge and looked to see how high the river was, and they were looking at the surface flooding on the fields around to kind of get a sense for like what they needed to do in terms of the weather and the flood itself. But for earthquake early warning, it's not necessarily as clear cut, but one of the things we did find and did wonder about from the Japanese study was that a lot of people, when they get the warning, they stop and stand still. And I think some of that is them waiting for the environmental cue of like, can I hear something? Am I starting to feel something? So I think that environmental cue is quite important in the earthquake early warning context, and how you deal with that, and the whole warning situation. Yeah, I don't know, but
Julia, that waiting for the environmental cue is almost for people to that kind of, you know, they're waiting for that to validate whether they think that the warning is real or not. Like when they receive the warning, there's still that inclination of like, is this real? Is this not? And so they're waiting.
It's possibly part of that information seeking loop that Sally talked about at the end. So they've got a warning, they've kind of processed it, and now they're seeking that extra bit of information about, you know, can I feel the P wave? Can I sense the shaking coming? Can I hear anything? So yeah, I think you're right. I think it's part of that.
Yeah.
Can I add a little bit? I mean, just to extend what Julia said. I mean, I think earthquake early warning, I mean, if you're only kind of thinking about the warning space, I mean, it's very short, right? But yeah, as Gavin said, I mean, it can be a campaign after that, what you do. So that's a different, not different in the sense, but you have more time to do that. But I think when it comes to probably where people have to make the quickest decision, I think it attached to earthquake early warning kind of thing. So how, when you are in that kind of really complex and time critical situations, people, I think it's kind of, people work differently to make decisions. Like if you look at some of the work I did with firefighters, where they work in life threatening situations, so their decision making mental models are totally different to where you have a bit more time, like 10-15 minutes or more hours. So you'll have to be really careful, because you are going to use the working memory of people giving like 5 sentences, asking people to process that inside their memory and make a life or kind of life-saving decision within that. It's a totally different ball game, right? If you go into situation awareness theory, they are talking about a lot of situation awareness issues, mistakes people can do if your information system is not capable of providing that information in the right way that they can process it in a kind of in timely manner. Because we are not talking about more than a minute here, we are talking about like seconds. So probably the type of the messaging type semantic can be totally different. I mean, it's again can be a fascinating research for us to do, not only talking about the words, what are the better words, but we'll have to link that back to how people process these words in their brain. So it's probably we need to talk to psychologists and understand this. I mean, people linking back naturalistic decision-making models like recognition prime or something similar, because the warning type in this case can be different if you're only talking about that initial warning space. But when it goes to that chain of messages until you close it off, it's a slightly different thing. So, I mean, that's just something to add.
Thanks, Raj. All right, so we've done really well. We've all kept to time, and we're now at just wrap up the session. So, but provide the floor for anyone else who hasn't had the chance to speak but want to contribute. If anyone wants to.
CCC iPhone.
All right. So I think I guess it's almost 12. So and thank you everyone for sticking through the session. And we have great conversations. Heard a lot from different people. I think we started off with Julia giving an overview of what's kind of the potential of earthquake early warning here in New Zealand. And then we heard from Caroline on what's the perspective from a duty seismologist on earthquake early warning. And I think that was a pretty good insight. And then we heard from Garrick on the project that they're doing in Waikato and trying to see how the feasibility of creating a network and looking at different probably algorithms and testing that through. And I think it's a space that everyone might be looking forward to. And we had some questions about 5G, 4G, 3G, and how this network would be integrated together. And during that discussion, we also kind of like look at, okay, how can we work as a community, and making sure that taking advantage of this opportunity that we can actually talk to people before systems being in place. Is there a way for us to have a national network, a way for us to have ways of warning that's standardized? So really good discussion there. And then we want to hear from Hamish on his insights of some of the key issues, I guess, and questions on how we're going to go about earthquake early warning. So that was really good points. We went through the presentation that Bill shared to us about the P-alert system, and then we had another great discussion from the floor. And then finally, taking a step back, we look at warnings and heard a little bit from Sally on how we can create concise messaging, and then heard from Sara on her work on high weather impact-based warnings, and some really interesting questions, Sara, on how we can translate that in the earthquake space. And then, so I'm really impressed that everyone stuck through, and then having really great discussions. And definitely there's an opportunity for us to move this discussion forward, and just really want to thank the speakers for their time, and also for everyone else in this room taking the time to listen and also contribute to questions. And thanks, Gavin, for also all the questions that you raised and the points that you put in the chat.
And can I ask a question? I mean, kind of request, because there are a lot of things discussed. It's really useful, I think, to a wider community than this. I think it can raise awareness and discussion points. So now in our community of practice, we have a blog. So I don't know whether you are recording this. Is there a possibility that we can use the recording in the community of practice blog? I don't know. Because this is TechWeek, right? So TechWeek they broadcast this live as well. If we can, I think a lot of people will get benefits listening to it. I don't know.
That's a really good
just
point.
a request, yeah.
Good point, Raj. We're actually recording it, and we're actually going to also kind of edit it a little bit, so it just is going to be in a manageable chunks rather than sitting through a 2-hour video. So we'll and if we're going to ask the speakers whether they could share, they're happy to share that, but definitely we'll want to be able to distribute this to wider network. So thanks for raising that point. And any from my co-facilitators, any final comments?
No, well done, Marianne. That was
well done. Excellent.
Good job. Thank you, everybody, for participating, asking questions, presenting ideas. Yeah, earthquake early warning in New Zealand.
All right. So thanks, everyone, and hope to see you in future discussions as well. All right.
Yeah, bye.
Thank you.